Hey guys, I'm Abby Sharp. Welcome to Abby's Kitchen. In today's video, we will be revisiting a previous What I Eat in a Day review that I did on Stephanie Joshi from Nutty Foodie Fitness. Now, this video ended up stirring up quite the controversy, and after some serious thought and reflection, I did find that there were a few things that I wanted to clear up about my previous comments on Stephanie's videos to add better context, and a few things that I would like to add. Now, in future videos that I shoot, I will be adding a disclaimer that the videos that I watch cannot fully represent the full catalog of their content. So while I do my best, and we spend about 8 hours on YouTube viewing alone, it is of course impossible for me to catch every nuance and all the context. Now, before we start, a few other disclaimers that the information in this video is for entertainment and educational purposes only, so you should always speak to a healthcare provider about your unique healthcare needs. Also, please, as always, be kind in the comments, both here and on Stephanie's channels. A trigger warning that some graphics or discussions may be disturbing to some viewers, so of course you can always feel free to skip this video. And do not forget to subscribe to this channel and ring that little bell so that you never miss out. Now, if you haven't watched my previous What I Eat in a Day video on Stephanie, you can check it out right here. But for those of you who maybe haven't seen it, or for those of you who have and need a quick little recap, here are my main takeaways from the previous review. Number one, Stephanie's positive attitude towards food. So I actually really like Stephanie's attitude towards food. We don't see Stephanie using any diety language whatsoever in her videos. She also does not seem to be overly preoccupied with her weight or how much she eats or what she eats or how many calories are in what she eats, which I really like. Stephanie is a true foodie at heart, and I love her non-diet approach to food. She doesn't use any diety language or follow any bogus diet culture rituals or food rules. She also isn't overly preoccupied with her weight or what and how much she eats, which I do think is really helpful for some people who are struggling with dieting or are just concerned with eating perfectly all the time. Number two, she is highly in tune with her hunger cues. Stephanie really knows her hunger and gives herself full permission to eat when she's hungry and as much as it takes to feel totally satisfied. Even if this does look like a lot of food to a lot of people, she continues to honor her hunger and doesn't restrict herself. Number three, she shares empowering messages towards eating. Stephanie is totally aware of her unique metabolism and appetite, and she repeatedly tells her viewers that everyone's bodies are unique and different, and what works for her may not work for somebody else. She also encourages her followers to not be afraid of food, and even has a video where she eats her followers' fear foods as a way to normalize them. Now, number four was that there were some health implications of concern. Despite Stephanie's relaxed and flexible attitude towards food, which I totally applaud and appreciate, there were a few health implications about Stephanie's diet that I did flag. Our analysis showed that Stephanie was eating much higher amounts of saturated fat, sodium, and sugar than what would be recommended for the average adult woman. While it's totally great and fine to eat these foods in moderation, my only concern around Stephanie's consumption was that the frequency and quantity of these kinds of foods in her diet may put her at risk for some negative health outcomes like heart disease in the future. Now, a lot of you may ask, well, if she's eating intuitively, and I do believe that she is, then why does this even matter? It might not. It honestly might not. But anytime I make a comment about a meal or a dietary pattern on YouTube, it's less directed at the unique individual because, hey, I'm not Stephanie's dietitian and I don't follow her diet every single day. But rather, I'm making statements to the general population based on population statistics and needs. And I do this simply to help you understand basic nutrition and to give you some shortcuts in helping you gather data on what works for your body. If this way of eating works for Stephanie and feels good to her, amazing. But research suggests that this amount of saturated fat, sugar, and salt probably wouldn't feel balanced or result in really good health outcomes for a lot of people. And number 5, my comments came off as me making wrongful insinuations about binge eating and cheat days. I believe that part of being a good professional is acknowledging when your opinions change on a topic or when you've been wrong in the past, rather than just getting defensive and, putting your guard up. While it's never ever my intentions to tarnish any creator's reputation or to insinuate a creator is purposefully engaging in deceit with their audience, I feel very badly that that may have happened in this case. And I'm taking full responsibility for it by addressing these issues today. This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. I had structured the original video as me essentially going through some of the most plausible reasons for Stephanie's extreme fluctuations in intake. And based on my experience, the most common cause of this extreme hunger is previous caloric restriction. I commented that this behavior did look like the extreme hunger that we'd seen with other YouTubers like Stephanie Buttermore. And to a casual viewer, all of those food challenges may be aligned with typical cheat day mentality. If you're a longtime viewer of my channel, you know that unfortunately we see this a lot in the YouTube space where diet culture and disorderly messaging is rampant. This is just so common in what we see here across the platform that it admittedly likely clouded my view of her content. That is a bias that I can now see, and since making that video, I've made extra effort to be more mindful of constantly challenging that bias in my content. Even though I never accused or diagnosed any of these behaviors, none of this means that Stephanie has an eating disorder or that she is necessarily restricting or that she's throwing up her food. None of that is necessarily truth. We don't know that. I don't know that. I can see why to some of you or to Stephanie, it felt like it was implied. So I want to apologize to Stephanie and her viewers if my previous video was insensitive and insinuated that Stephanie was engaging in typical binge restrict behavior. My initial intention was to point out that to a casual viewer, Stephanie's content may look like a binge or cheat day and may therefore be triggering for some people who are struggling, as this was the feedback that I received from a lot of you when you requested the video in the first place. However, I clearly did a poor job communicating this message, and I should have really dug deeper to fully understand Stephanie's unique case to be a better advocate for her. And for that, I do apologize. Funny timing, during the time that we were preparing today's video, Stephanie released a video where her and her dad discussed their thoughts and concerns about my previous What I Eat in a Day review. Now, I can totally understand their critique of my video and how it may have been interpreted. But again, it wasn't my intention to upset anyone or spread any misinformation about Stephanie. Thankfully, we did have a kind and respectful exchange in the comments, and I feel good that I was at least able to apologize for some of my missteps. So Stephanie, like I said, keep doing what you're doing and eating that peanut butter girl. You have my full support. With that said, in today's video, I want to take a closer look at the role of genetics and metabolism, whether or not genetic tests are legit, and also to briefly talk about some of the other possible reasons one might need a lot of food. First, let's take a look at the results of Stephanie's genetic tests. This was included in a video that I regretfully missed because we generally have a rule for our What I Eat in a Day research not to go back beyond a year's worth of content just to account for any major changes in a YouTuber's lifestyle. But let's take a peek.
All is equal, your genotype or genotype has the lowest impact. My carbohydrate sensitivity is the lowest, which would in turn explain why I am able to consume more carbs than some. My specific genetic response to fat intake is again on very low. You have a lower sensitivity for genes related to fat absorption, putting you in our lowest score bracket possible for response to fat intake. The genes in this panel impact the way your body absorbs, transports, and metabolizes dietary fat. Your genetic profile means you have the lowest effect on these factors from fat intake, meaning you are well placed to deal with fat intake, genetically speaking. When all other factors are equal, your genotype has the lowest impact on your fat absorption and metabolism compared to other genotypes.
Okay, so according to the results of the genetic tests, Stephanie has a low sensitivity to carbohydrates and saturated fat. This supposedly explains why she's able to consume large quantities of these types of foods while still remaining very lean and, assumedly, metabolically healthy. I will get into the accuracy of these types of genetic tests later on in the video, but for now, let's just break down those results. So according to her test results, her low sensitivity to carbs means she has greater insulin sensitivity and blood sugar control after consuming carbs. So this basically means that when insulin is released into the body in response to carbohydrate intake, the body is more sensitive to the insulin in the bloodstream and is therefore able to more efficiently absorb and use glucose for energy. This allows blood sugar levels to remain more even and reduces the likelihood of those blood sugar spikes. On the other hand, somebody with a high sensitivity to carbs may be less sensitive to insulin and not as efficient at absorbing glucose from the bloodstream, which can result in greater spikes in blood sugar levels. As for the saturated fat, the results of this test suggest that her genotype has the lowest impact on the absorption and metabolism of saturated fats compared to other genotypes. And as we saw from my previous review, Stephanie had consumed around 16 times more saturated fat than what is recommended for the general population. Now, I don't know if this is a regular pattern for Stephanie. All I can do is go off of the information that she shares on her channel. But assuming that eating a large amount of saturated fat is the norm for Stephanie, then the average person would theoretically gain more weight or experience more health concerns from saturated fat than what we have observed from Stephanie. Now, it's important to note that the report, at least from what I can see, did not really go into detail about the intersection of this genotype, saturated fat, and actual health risks that are commonly associated with saturated fat, namely heart disease. Now, this is a highly controversial topic, which is why I did a whole video on saturated fats right here. But while the jury is still not completely aligned with whether or not saturated fat causes heart disease, it doesn't appear to help. So until we have more conclusive findings, we generally do recommend replacing most of the saturated fat in your diet with unsaturated fats or higher fiber carbs, both of which do appear to support heart health. Stephanie seems to focus on the impact of these findings with regards to her lean physique, but I'm way more interested in their impact on long-term health risks. If this genetic test is accurate, which again, I will get into soon, it does state in the very limited vague copy there that the genes in the panel impact how fats or carbs are metabolized and absorbed, and therefore their impact on your blood panel. But still, nothing that I can see about what really matters, and that to me is absolute health risk. I do worry that this could be an invitation for some people to make potentially damaging conclusions like go ahead and eat unlimited refined carbs and saturated fat from a bunch of correlations that might not even be strong correlations to begin with. I do see from the tiniest snippets from the document that she shared here that it looks like they are giving specific recommendations, like if you have low sensitivity to saturated fats, then you should, cap your saturated fats at 10%, and if you're medium, 8%, etc. But again, I'm just not sure if the quality of the data warrants these types of very specific recommendations. Not to mention, I'm just aware of how the average layperson may interpret this data and may end up taking these recommendations to an extreme. Again, before I get all hyped up, I will get into that soon. Now, next we have her salt sensitivity results. Let's take a look.
I actually have a raised salt sensitivity. I can't say that I cook with a lot of salt, but I do consume a lot of salty peanuts. Peanuts just chilling beside me. I will keep an eye on that.
Okay, so according to the results, Stephanie has a higher salt sensitivity and is encouraged to reduce her sodium intake as a result of this. Now, our nutrient analysis in my last video indicated that on average, Stephanie consumed about 10 times the daily recommendation for sodium. Now, for a lot of people, high intakes of sodium can cause bloating right after a meal. And on a more serious note, over time, it can also cause increased blood pressure and heart disease. But regardless of whether or not this test result is valid, the recommendation to limit sodium intake is pretty generic, universal advice that can be applied to the majority of people. Interestingly, salt and saturated fats do tend to go hand in hand in a lot of food, particularly if we're talking about convenience foods or restaurant foods. So unless she's eating like a lot of unsalted butter and meat without any seasoning, which would be boring, it would be pretty hard to really get an excessive amount of saturated fat without also getting a good amount of salt. Next was their diet recommendation, and I do want to watch this one for sure.
The Mediterranean diet most closely fits my results. By the way, yes, I'm half Spanish. The Mediterranean diet contains good fat sources in the form of olive oil and nuts. Stay nutty. It says the combined results of your genetic response to carbohydrates and fats would suggest that a Mediterranean diet would be a good start point for your profile. I definitely consume a lot of nuts, but it also says as well as oily fish. Quite interesting because in my other result I found that I had a raised need for omega-3, which is found in foods such as fish, mackerel, salmon and sardines, which are a great source of omega-3. Up until about 2 years ago, I consumed no fish at all, which is outrageous given that, you know, I am half Spanish.
So I think it's pretty cool that this test provides individualized dietary recommendations based on the results, which I think is the whole point of taking a test like this anyway, or why someone like a dietitian might use these genetic tests in their practice. This would definitely help a user put all of these complicated puzzle pieces together into a generally palatable diet. But I will say, again, this does sound like pretty generic advice that can be applied towards the majority of people. Even those without Stephanie's unique gene pool can probably benefit from the Mediterranean diet, as it has been shown to have a variety of health benefits and is probably one of the most evidence-based patterns of eating. For example, research suggests that the Mediterranean diet can lead to significant improvements in heart health markers like cholesterol and blood pressure. Another 2019 review showed that the diet is associated with a lower risk of heart disease and stroke in people with diabetes. In addition to its heart health benefits, the Mediterranean diet has also been shown to protect against type 2 diabetes and reduce inflammation. Now, with that said, I think that the Mediterranean diet is a great option for Stephanie and would totally help to fill in any little nutritional gaps that I saw on my previous review. So for example, we know that despite all of the amazing nut butter and nuts that are happening in her diet, which is great, love the healthy fats in nuts, and so does the Mediterranean diet, there are days where Stephanie consumes a lot of saturated fats, like we talked about. So the Mediterranean diet may help her pivot towards more olive oil, avocado, seeds, seafood, and yes, keeping up those nuts. Now, in addition to the healthy fats, the diet also recommends consuming more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, eggs, while also limiting things like highly processed foods, refined grains, added sugars, and trans fats. So overall, I think that this is a great recommendation to help minimize the potential risks of a diet high in sodium and saturated fat, specifically for Stephanie, of course, but also for most people in commercialized societies. Now that I've talked about some of the recommendations of the test, let's discuss whether or not those were all totally moot points and if genetic testing for diet and exercise is actually legit. So nutrigenomics, or nutrigenetics, is a fairly new and exciting area of research that looks at the genetic variations in an individual's DNA to determine whether certain genes influence the way that foods are absorbed and metabolized. Genetic testing can also provide information about whether or not an individual is predisposed to certain health problems. Because of its potential value, a lot of registered dietitians and doctors have now begun using genetic testing in their practice to supplement their health assessments and provide individualized recommendations. Now, although the literature in this area is still emerging and more evidence is needed to fully support the use of nutrigenomics, we of course do know that there is a genetic component to body weight and nutrient needs. So for example, one study compared the DNA of individuals with smaller and larger bodies and found that genetics did of course play a significant factor. Makes total sense and is completely aligned with a lot of what I talk about when I discuss body acceptance. Another study found that individuals with a particular genotype lost more weight by following a high-carb diet, while individuals with a different genotype had better results following a high-protein diet. Again, makes sense that everyone responds differently to different ways of eating, and this may have a genetic component. Other research has looked at the genetic variations of more than 400,000 individuals and found that genetics did play an important role at determining where body fat is distributed, explaining why some people are pear-shaped and others are more apple-shaped. As for the role of genetics and metabolism, some research points towards the UCP1 gene as the genetic explanation behind differences in metabolism and body weight. So, for example, a study on 82 healthy females found that women with a specific genotype variant of the UCP1 gene had a lower resting metabolic rate, while other women with a different genotype variant had a higher metabolic rate. Variations in other genes, like the CYP1A2 gene, I feel like Obi-Wan Kenobi, but variations in that gene can indicate whether an individual is a slow or fast metabolizer of caffeine, and based on this information, whether or not they should be limiting their trips to Starbucks every day. Another example is the ACE gene, which can indicate whether or not an individual is at risk of high blood pressure in the presence of a high sodium diet. So this may help explain why some of us, have chronically low blood pressure even when we eat a really salty meal. While genetics do appear to play an important role in an individual's metabolism, body weight, and their response to food, can genetic tests accurately assess someone's unique dietary needs? Unfortunately, because the evidence in this area is so limited and new, most experts agree that the accuracy of these tests is questionable and should be taken with a grain of salt. For one, not all genetic tests on the market are created equal or use the same evidence to support their recommendations. Some companies may look at a wider range of genetic markers, even if the research on these genes is based on polygenic traits, which are basically based on multiple alleles or genes, and is solely correlational based. Correlational data tells us that two things are linked, but it doesn't actually explain why or how they're linked. In other words, especially when we're talking about polygenic traits, we don't really know for sure which part of the gene or allele is really at work. We just know that there's a relationship between a trait and a series of genes. It's therefore very possible and probably quite common that a particular gene may play no role at all in a trait, but may just be simply present in those with a trait. It's also not uncommon for different companies to look at the same genes and have completely different interpretations of the results and different recommendations. So this could mean that you can take two tests from two very different companies and receive completely different recommendations. It's also important to note that some genes have just been studied in more depth than others. For example, the CYP1A2 gene, which I talked about, which looks at an individual's sensitivity to caffeine, and the MTHFR gene, which is involved in the breakdown of amino acid homocysteine, have been researched more than, let's say, the SLC23A1 gene, which supposedly reports on healthy outcomes related to vitamin C status. Let's just say that we desperately need some clinical practice guidelines in nutrigenomics, as well as some standardization on which genes are ethical to track. With that in mind, genetic tests are not diagnostic and should not replace health advice from quality health professionals like a doctor or registered dietitian who can help you interpret and understand which of these results to take more seriously and which to maybe take with a grain of salt. These tests should also be used in conjunction with other health assessments. So for example, if the results of a genetic test indicates that you have an increased need for vitamin D, for example, as was actually the case for Stephanie, it would not be advisable to just start taking high doses of vitamin D supplements without maybe getting your blood work taken to confirm an actual vitamin deficiency. In addition, a lower high sensitivity to fat or carbohydrates should not be a replacement for getting regular blood work taken to check for important health markers like blood cholesterol and blood sugar levels. It also shouldn't give you free rein to order fried chicken sandwiches every single day for lunch. And I'm not saying that Stephanie does any of these things. I'm mainly just talking for the general population. I also worry that these tests will be used to replace valid information from your body. So for example, just because your test says that you can tolerate higher amounts of sugar, does that really mean that eating a pint of Ben & Jerry's every day will feel good for you? It might, but it also might not. So I'm always wary of letting too much of this correlational science replace the delicate art of intuitive eating. Again, I'm not saying that this is the case for Stephanie because I really do think that she is eating intuitively and is in tune with her body, but I'm just speaking for the general population. Now, I asked my dietitian colleagues who work in nutrigenomics what their thoughts were on this particular test, DNA Fit. And they expressed some concern that this particular test included a lot of genes with weak correlational research when compared to other tests that they prefer to use. They also commented on the fact that it draws on what a lot of them called sensationalized wellness culture language, which made them a little bit weary of their efficacy. When I looked more into the test online, there were a lot of mixed reviews, with a lot of people saying that it provided very generalized recommendations. And that's not ideal if you're dishing out $200 with the expectation of receiving personalized nutrition and fitness information. So what I'm saying is, don't think that you're getting greater bang for your buck by choosing a test that looks at more traits or genes. It is very likely that a lot of those traits are not so well studied, and the associations may be a bit of a stretch. Again, this is why I recommend working with an experienced registered dietitian in nutrigenomics who can help to kind of walk you through those results. Genetic tests should not be used as a replacement for other valid or reliable health assessments that measure nutrient deficiencies and other important health markers. Now, regardless of whether or not the genetic test here is legit, I do wholeheartedly believe that Stephanie just has a really fast metabolism and that genetics do play a role here. But aside from getting some genetic tests, which may or may not be accurate, what is the best way to actually determine a person's needs? Well, in clinical settings, a dietitian would most often use predictive equations to figure out how many calories a person needs based on their height, weight, age, and activity level. However, as we know, everyone has very unique needs, and these predictive equations are far from perfect. They are honestly most useful for providing a quick estimate for the average person, but they don't really give us a precise figure. For instance, a predictive equation might estimate that you need 2,000 calories a day, but you might find that you just feel better and have more energy when consuming fewer or more calories than what was estimated. That calculation also doesn't really take into consideration variations within a person, and that some days you'll just need more calories than others due to subtle changes in activity, hormones, sleep patterns, sickness, etc. This is why it's so important to rely on your own hunger and fullness cues to guide your eating, rather than whatever an online calculator says, as your body will provide the best indicator for your unique energy needs. And it seems like Stephanie does that, which is great. If you really want to know how much a person needs when it comes to calories, you would have to do an indirect calorimetry test. Instead of looking at an individual's height, weight, age, and activity level, indirect calorimetry estimates energy needs by evaluating gas exchange and measuring how much oxygen the body requires versus how much carbon dioxide it produces. Indirect calorimetry is considered the gold standard when it comes to measuring energy needs. However, it's very expensive and isn't available in most clinical settings, never mind something that the average person would ever have access to. With this in mind, when we consider Stephanie's energy needs, a standard predictive equation would estimate that she requires approximately 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day, depending on her activity level that day. But we also know that on average, Stephanie consumes anywhere between like 3,000 and 7,000 calories a day, sometimes even more as we see in some of her challenge days. And it seems like she's doing it intuitively. So we can only assume that if we were to measure her needs using indirect calorimetry, that they would be much higher than what can be estimated using a predictive equation. So yes, Stephanie very likely does have a higher than average metabolism. I would assume that this has some strong genetic origins, but it may also be modified by things like her age, muscle mass, physical activity, hormones, and her microbiome. In fact, more and more research is now pointing to the importance of the gut microbiome and its roles in regulating energy metabolism, energy expenditure, and body weight. A 2009 study evaluating the gut microbiomes of 154 subjects found that leaner individuals had greater bacterial diversity in their gut. Some research also suggests that the bacteria in the microbiome can extract more or less calories from food and therefore can influence subsequent weight gain or weight loss. This means that two people can eat the exact same amount of food but not actually absorb the same amount of calories from that food due to the variations in their gut microbiome. So this could explain why someone like Stephanie can eat a large amount of calories and remain lean, while somebody else might eat the same amount of food as Stephanie and gain weight. And since we're now on the topic of metabolism, I thought we could also talk about hypermetabolism and some of the underlying health conditions that may result in an increased metabolism. First, I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to diagnose or insinuate that Stephanie's fast metabolism is due to any kind of underlying health condition. I mean, we are all born with superpowers, and being able to very efficiently use fuel is likely one of Stephanie's. But just for interest and education's sake, I did want to discuss some health conditions that may put an individual in a hypermetabolic state. Hypermetabolism, compared to just having a generally fast metabolism, like maybe Stephanie, is defined as having an elevated resting energy expenditure of over 110%. Usually an individual will enter a hypermetabolic state when recovering from an injury, a burn, or when they're struggling with cancer. Pretty much any condition where your metabolism is revved up to help heal or recover your body. As a result of having an increased energy expenditure, hypermetabolism can lead to involuntary weight loss, elevated heart rate and blood pressure, muscle weakness, shortness of breath, excessive sweating, and an increased need for calories. While hypermetabolism can be a consequence of injuries and cancer, it can also be a sign of some of these underlying health conditions. So first is hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is characterized by an overactive thyroid gland which overproduces thyroid hormones, causing an increase in metabolic activity. Some common symptoms of hyperthyroidism include increased appetite, frequent bowel movements, weight loss, irregular menstrual cycles, hair loss, and restlessness. Hyperthyroidism is often treated with medication to stop the thyroid from overproducing thyroid hormones, as well as surgery to remove part or all of the thyroid gland. Next is Graves' disease. So Graves' disease is an autoimmune disorder that also causes the thyroid gland to overproduce thyroid hormone in the body and is one of the most common causes of hypothyroidism. Because of this, Graves' disease and hypothyroidism share many of the same symptoms. Graves' disease is also 8 times more common in women than in men and has a very strong genetic component. Treatment options for Graves' disease are likewise similar to those of hyperthyroidism since they are so strongly linked. Now, third is eating disorder recovery. Eating disorder recovery can also result in a temporary state of hypermetabolism during weight restoration as the body recovers from being in a prolonged period of starvation. This means that individuals recovering from eating disorders like anorexia, who experience hypermetabolism, require substantially more calories to restore their bodies back to baseline. I really liked what I heard Stephanie Buttermore say in a recent video of hers to explain her high calorie needs when going all in, where she said that after being in a caloric deficit for so long, she really had to kind of pay back the debt and also pay interest at the very start of her journey. Generally, an individual's metabolism will go back to normal about 3 to 6 months after they fully weight restore. Then there's lipodystrophy. So lipodystrophy is not a clinical manifestation of hypermetabolism, but is instead an abnormality in the way that the body uses and stores fat. Some individuals with lipodystrophy lack fat cells, so they can appear very muscular and defined. However, leptin, which is the satiety hormone that tells us when we're full, is made in fat cells. So because individuals with lipodystrophy lack fat cells, they do not create enough leptin. This means that they can eat large quantities of food without actually knowing when they're full. And because their body doesn't store fat where most of us do, in our bellies and our bums, fat can accumulate in the liver, which can lead to fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, and high cholesterol. Oftentimes, these individuals may have to actually inject leptin hormone to help curb their hunger and protect their liver from the accumulation of too much fat. And finally, up for discussion is pancreatic insufficiency. So pancreatic insufficiency doesn't really result in hypermetabolism per se, but it's still worth mentioning here. So the pancreas not only helps to regulate blood sugar levels, but it also plays a really important role in digestion by creating digestive enzymes. However, when the pancreas stops producing enzymes to support digestion, the body is unable to properly digest and absorb fats. Because fats are unable to be absorbed by the body without digestive enzymes, food kind of passes through the body undigested, which can result in extreme weight loss. This can also lead to vitamin deficiency, especially those fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K. In these cases, it's often recommended to take an oral pancreatic enzyme supplement to support digestion and prevent malnourishment. Now, when I brought Stephanie's case anonymously to my dietitian practice group, everyone was like spitballing all of these potential clinical reasons for Stephanie's obviously very high metabolism. It is definitely super interesting as a clinician to go into diet detective mode with thousands of really, really highly educated and experienced professionals. Obviously, none of us know Stephanie's actual case, so all of this was totally hypothetical for the purpose of discussion and learning. But one thing that did leave pretty much everyone a bit perplexed was the sheer variation in caloric intake between her different What I Ate in a Day videos. This was the confusing thing for me too, back in my first video and still here today. As I said in my last video, while it's very normal to not eat the same amount of calories each day, research suggests that the average daily caloric variability for women should be plus or minus 25% of their total actual energy needs. Normally, even if a person had a genetic predisposition to a really high metabolism or was managing one of the conditions that I just spoke to, which can increase metabolism, we wouldn't see a 70 to 450% variation from day to day. Alas, the cool thing about nutrition is that while I speak here to the masses, every single person is truly unique, and Stephanie's a really cool case study to follow. And ultimately, if her body is giving these broad fluctuating messages for consumption, and this is what feels good to her, to me, it's absolutely the right way to eat. Bottom line, considering how Stephanie talks about food and her body, I do want to clarify that we can only assume that her unique energy needs are the result of a fast metabolism. I did try to communicate this in my last video, but I admit that the point was lost because I was presenting the case disproportionately from a restrict binge lens. That is my error, and I am owning it. Obviously, we really can't understand what Stephanie's specific energy needs are without doing a full and accurate energy needs assessment. And we also can't rely on genetic testing alone, as it only gives us correlational data, which may or may not be accurate. Again, I want to apologize to Stephanie and her viewers if my previous video sounded like I was insinuating that Stephanie was engaging in problematic disordered behavior. But I do want to reiterate that the main driving point of my previous video was that it may be triggering for some people who interpret Stephanie's videos in this way. Having said that, I also want to give credit where credit is due and give Stephanie a huge virtual high five in acknowledgement that her videos may also help others normalize certain beliefs and practices around food. Ultimately, it's all up to interpretation, and different people's histories and struggles are likely going to inform how these things are interpreted. So Stephanie, keep doing you. Continue to reject diet mentality, continue to be a good role model for those struggling with fear foods, and continue to fuel your body with whatever feels good to you. Clearly, it's working because you seem very much at peace with your body and with food. And on that note, that is all for today's video, and another reminder to please be kind in the comments, both here and on Stephanie's channel. If you like this video, be sure to give it the thumbs up. Leave me a comment below with who you'd like to see me review next. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time on Abbey's Kitchen. Bye!